All right, going to go over a couple things for class that we've been learning. We're going to talk about electrophysiology today. We're going to talk about resting membrane potentials, the Nernst equation, kind of why ions want to move in and out of a cell. And we're going to describe that kind of with a graph, kind of help us understand what that looks like when ions are moving in and out and what that does to the state in terms of polarization to a cell. Then we'll get into driving force. I'm going to explain the driving force equation. I'm going to get into examples with driving force, and then I'll show some important values for particular ions that we're interested in that play a role in potential action potentials, graded potentials, things like that. And then I'm going to get into graded potentials. So we'll talk about graded potentials in form of a graph, and then what induces a graded potential. And then we'll get into the bulk of it, action potentials. We'll talk about why action potentials fire, how they do. I'll do that through graphs, flow chart, draw out a membrane of a neuron. We'll talk about what's coming in, what's going out. We'll talk about polarization, refractory periods, and then the effects of changing ion concentration, what that has on the cell, okay? And then I'm gonna get into capacitance and length constants. And this is kind of gonna describe how an action potential moves, propagation through the cell, through the neuron. And then we'll talk about myelin and how that speeded up and what happens when you have multiple sclerosis and what happens when the myelin's gone and how that affects the speed at which a neuron fires. So we'll try to get through this pretty quick and also be pretty detailed and effective. So let's get into it. So I'll start with electrophysiology. Okay, some important things to understand with electrophysiology is, number one, we kind of want to draw this out. May want to make that a little bigger. Okay, so with electrophysiology, what we know is that we have something right here called the sodium-potassium pump, okay? And this is important, not that it has anything to do with resting membrane potential, because that's what we're going to talk about right now, resting membrane potential. And basically, in a neuron, because we're talking about action potentials later, we have this negative charge, net negative charge on the inside, net positive charge on the outside. And what we found as we do some calculations that I'll show you is that with the Goldman's equation, neuron wants to sit at negative 70 millivolts for its resting membrane potential, okay? And this value is important because the sodium potassium pump doesn't actually have anything to do with this, but it kind of sets up the graded potential that then has an effect on why we have a resting membrane potential. So ATP ACE. So we have the sodium potassium pump. We know that this is bringing out 3 sodium ions and it's bringing in 2 potassium ions, right? So we got 2 potassium ions, 3 sodium ions coming out. Now this is happening really, really fast in a lot of cells and a lot of pumps in all those cells. And so we find that we have this high potassium concentration that builds up on the inside, and we have a high sodium concentration that builds up on the outside of the cell, okay? So what ends up happening is you get these concentration gradients that start to develop. And when we talk about resting membrane potential, the key thing is understanding that you have these potassium leaking channels. And what these potassium leaking channels do is they're open all the time, and so they're controlled by this thing called concentration gradient. And because sodium's high, or potassium's high inside, low outside, we know that concentration goes from high concentration to low concentration, right? It's the opposite of osmolarity, the movement of water. So we get these solutes that move, they want to be in equilibrium, they kind of want to even out. So they're going to keep moving out of the cell. And so what ends up happening is you start to get a more negative charge build up inside the cell. It starts to hyperpolarize a little bit. And we know it's positive on the outside, but it really gets an attractive force to all these positive ions that are flowing out of the cell. And so they find their way being pulled back to the cell, and they make their way back through. And these potassium move in, and this is called the electrical gradient. And so together, the electrical gradient and the concentration gradient, okay, make up the electrochemical gradient. Okay, and this is what plays the #1 factor in resting membrane potential. Okay, now sodium, if we increase or decrease it, it does not have anything to do with changing resting membrane potential. Okay, anything changing resting membrane potential will have to do with the circulation of the concentration of gradient of potassium coming out and the electrical gradient of potassium coming in. So in turn, the electrochemical gradient will make up how this is going in and out and why we have a resting membrane potential at -70 millivolts. Okay, so now we have the Nernst equation. So what the Nernst equation tells us is that certain ions, like potassium and sodium, we'll take potassium for example, certain ions, they want to sit at a certain resting membrane potential. Their own, they want it at a certain resting membrane potential. And so we have the Nernst equation. And what this tells us is EX, so that desired resting membrane potential, equals -61.5 over Z log of the concentration of potassium in over the concentration of potassium out. Okay? So we see that with this equation, we can take the concentration of the potassium in over the concentration of the potassium out. Log Z is just going to be the, whether it's negative or positive, so the charge on the ion, and then this will give us its desired state. So when we run this for a couple ions like sodium and potassium, we find that, I'll get to that later. I guess I can get to these right now, and I'll hit on them later again. But sodium, potassium, sodium wants to be at positive 55 millivolts. And then potassium, potassium wants to be at negative 94 millivolts. And so we see that potassium plays a bigger role in the resting membrane potential because it's at negative 70 millivolts. And so we can see it's closer to potassium. Potassium's playing a huge effect on why it's sitting at negative 70. And so together with other ions, they have it sit at negative 70 millivolts, okay? So I'm gonna draw out a graph here. Hopefully this will help us out. Just talk about a couple things here. So, how do I want to do this? So we have negative 70 millivolts, and then we have negative 55, and 0, and positive 55, and we have negative 94. Okay, and so what ends up happening is you have this charge here, this resting membrane potential, and this is resting membrane potential. And what ends up happening is sometimes you can have this ion concentration change where you get this state of depolarization. And then it can come back down. We call that repolarization. Or it can go down from resting membrane potential, and we call that and we call that hyperpolarization. And there's an important thing that we label here, and this is called threshold. And this is the voltage needed okay? This is the voltage needed to open ion channels, gated channels, okay? So threshold, the voltage needed to open ion gated channels, all right? So what we conclude from this is that when the resting membrane potential changes, we have these different polarized states that we can then recognize on a graph. Okay, so that's going to be the first section. Hopefully we understand resting membrane potential a little bit better. Okay, driving force. So with driving force, we have an equation that we like to use, and that's driving force is equal to Vm minus Ex. Okay? Now, if we were paying attention, Ex is the value we got from our Nernst equation. That was what I was just explaining before. Okay? And so we have that desired value that the ion wants to be at, and then Vm is going to be our RMP, resting membrane potential that's given. And so if I were to put up those values again, so Na plus, they want to be at positive 55 millivolts, and then K plus wants to be at negative 94 millivolts. So if we were to do an example problem, we could say, hey, our resting membrane potential is at negative 70, and then it goes to negative 50. What happens to the driving force or the desired concentration gradients of sodium and potassium? Where do they want to go, and what effect does that have on their driving force? And so we could say, hey, sodium, we know they want to be at positive 55. So we can take the equation and we can just say the driving force for sodium is equal to negative 70 millivolts. That's our resting membrane potential minus our Ex, and that is 55. And then we can also say that sodium driving force then change to negative 50, right? Millivolts, that's where our resting membrane potential changed to, minus positive 55. And so we get that this turns into negative 105, right? And then this turns into negative 125, right? Okay, then we'll graph this out in a second here. But what ends up happening is you also want to write out your potassium. So the driving force for potassium is equal to negative 70 millivolts minus a negative 94. So we know that that minus and minus turn into a plus, right? So we want to write this as plus 94. And so we get that this equals 24 millivolts, positive. And then a potassium driving force, negative 50, because remember the resting membrane potential changed to negative 50, so negative 50 millivolts, plus, because it's negative minus a negative, so it turns to positive, so it'd be plus the 94, and we would get 44, positive 44 millivolts. Okay, so in order to see if the driving force went up or down, it's best to see this through a graph. So you can see the driving force on the graph like this. So if we're at negative 70 millivolts and then it changed somehow to negative 50 millivolts, something happened, right? We know that sodium and A plus, they want to be up here at positive 55 millivolts. And we know that potassium, K plus, wants to be down here, all the way down at negative 94 millivolts, okay? So potassium wants to be all the way down at negative 94 millivolts. What we see is right here, there was a change that got us then up to negative 50. So if we were to calculate the driving force of sodium, we would see that the driving force is quite big. Sodium wants to come into the cell. Sodium, the cell's sitting at negative 70, resting membrane potential, right? Millivolts for RMP, okay? And it wants to come into the cell. Sodium's wanting to come in, that driving force is high, okay? But then we see that it changed to 50. So now our cell has changed to negative 50 millivolts. And what that does is it decreases that driving force, because now it's not as negative. So that positive doesn't really want to come in as much, okay? But when it's super negative, that positive really wants to come in. But right now the positive doesn't want to come in, so this actually lowers that driving force. And so we see that sodium in this case would have a smaller driving force as we went from negative 70 to negative 50 millivolts. Potassium, on the other hand, their driving force is small. Okay, if it's really negative in the cell, it doesn't really want to come in, or well, it's not wanting to leave as much. And so what we see though is that as we change it to negative 50, it's becoming more positive. Because this is more negative and potassium is positive, potassium wants to stay because it's attracted to that negative. But if it becomes more positive, we know that a positive and a positive, they repel each other. And so potassium becomes, as the cell becomes more positive, this potassium is like, hey, I want to get out of here. And so its desire to leave, its driving force is greater. And we see that on the graph. The driving force for potassium increases, okay, as we go from negative 70 to negative 50 millivolts on the resting membrane potential. So that's an example of driving force. That's an example of using some ions, their EX value and their desired state, and how we can graph this and kind of visualize how driving force is affected as the resting membrane potential of a cell changes, okay? So that's that for driving force. So I'm going to get into graded potentials now, okay? Whew. Graded potentials. All right. I think the red marker is my best one, so I'm going to use this one. Okay. Graded potentials. What they are is they're trying to stimulate the cell, but it's not enough to reach threshold, okay? So the best way to understand graded potentials, in my opinion, is drawing it out on a graph. We've already drawn out a couple of these graphs. So you have a negative 70 millivolts right here, and then you have a negative 55. Let's lower that down. Okay, right here would be like 0 millivolts, and then we have positive 55 millivolts, and then we would have negative 55 millivolts. Okay, so what ends up happening is you have this neuron that fires, right? And what ends up happening is you have this induction. And basically the induction is going to be some sort of stimulus, some sort of change in charge within the cell. and it's going to go from negative 70 to maybe, it'll go from negative 70 to negative 65. Okay, and so we know that a couple things need to be labeled on here. Well, for example, right here, this is threshold. And as I explained before, this is the voltage needed to open ion gated channels. Okay. Particularly the sodium voltage gated channels, because those will flood in. That's what changes and fires off in an action potential. And we'll go over that here in a second. But what ends up happening is we have this negative 70 millivolts. And where the graded potential is, you get close and then it comes back down. And right here would be that negative 65 millivolts, right? Where it came through, right there. And it's not enough to reach threshold. And so with the graded potential, what we know about these is they just don't exceed that threshold. Therefore, we don't end up having the sodium channels open up, leading to a depolarization, to a repolarization, to a hyperpolarization, and back to resting membrane potential. So the opposite of this is what we'll discuss now as we get into section 4 with action potentials. Okay? Whew, I've got the worst headache right now. Probably because I'm trying to think about all this stuff. Action potentials. Okay, first thing I want to do is I want to draw a flow chart of an action potential. What ends up happening with an action potential is we have this membrane, okay? And we have stimulus hit. So threshold's met. Na plus voltage gated channels open. And when these sodium voltage gated channels open up, we have this flow of sodium coming into the cell. Okay? And when that comes in, we get a very high positive charge within the cell. And this leads to depolarization. As we depolarize, we hit a certain level where the sodium channels will then close. Okay? And when these close, we have then these potassium channels that open up. So we also have potassium voltage gated channels. That open up. And potassium begins to flow out of the cell. And when potassium flows into the cell, what we find is that it repolarizes. Which leads to repolarization. And these two periods of depolarization, repolarization, we call the absolute refractory refractory period. I think it's like, this is like a factory reset. You can't do anything when an iPhone's on factory reset, right? It's redoing everything. And so what ends up happening is, in an absolute refractory period, you have no action potentials that can be fired at that time. And so we have this state of absolute refractory period where repolarization, depolarization, repolarization are occurring, and then we don't have this potential for an action potential to occur, okay? So you have repolarization, then the potassium channels, voltage gated channels, are slow to close, and so this leads to hyperpolarization. And in this process, we call this the relative refractory period. And what ends up happening in the relative refractory period is you can still get an action potential of fire, but because it's so low and hyperpolarized, it just takes a very strong stimulus to end up being able to get it to fire, okay? And so we're in this state of hyperpolarization. So what ends up happening is you have our famous sodium potassium pump. And this gets us back to a resting membrane potential, to a polarized state. Okay, and that's the gist. Missing quite a bit of details, but that's the gist of how action potentials work. Okay, I call that my little flow chart. Okay, so I guess I can graph this out and go over the polarized, repolarized states and things like that. So really quick, I guess, in comparison to that, this flow chart, you have negative 70 millivolts, right? And then you have this negative 55 millivolts, where we have threshold, and then we have 0 millivolts. And let's say way up here, we have negative 30, we have positive 30 millivolts, okay? And down here, we got negative 94 millivolts. Let's call this positive 55, just keep it simple. So what we see is with this graph, we have these action potentials that can be charted in terms of their states of polarization. So right here, we have our threshold that needs to be met. And I've already defined it 3 times for threshold, so we'll kind of just go with it, okay? Right here, there's threshold. But what ends up happening is you have this action potential that gets stimulated. And it gets stimulated, it hits threshold, and it opens up these sodium, potassium, these sodium channels, leaking channels, or these sodium voltage gated channels. And then the sodium channels close, and you have this repolarization step of this release of potassium through potassium gated channels, and then it hyperpolarizes. And the sodium potassium pump repolarizes it back to resting membrane potential. And so we call this RMP, resting membrane potential. We would call this the initial stimulus, right? In a state of depolarization. Once it passes threshold, we see that these sodium voltage gated channels open and thus depolarize the cell a lot, making it more positive. Once we hit up here, we have an A+ voltage gated channels close, and we have potassium voltage gated channels open. And with the positive charge leaving the cell, if we have a cell and it's positively charged, if we have positively charged potassium ions leaving, this number will go down, become more negative, right? And it gets so negative, we call this repolarization. And with repolarization, we end up overshooting it. And we end up in this state of hyperpolarization. Because the potassium gated channels, the voltage gated channels are slow to close. And so we get this overshot hyperpolarization. So what we end up seeing is, right here, we have another state of repolarization back to resting membrane potential. This time, the repolarization is done a little differently, and it's done by the sodium potassium pump. ATPase. To get it back to homeostasis, back to its resting membrane potential where it wants to be at. Okay? So that's kind of the gist of how the graph works. Those are the things I wanted to show on it. So I guess I'll draw the membrane of the neuron out last. Effects of sodium potassium on this. So let's go over a couple key things here. Right here, if we increase or decrease ion concentration. And then if we increase or decrease ion permeability. Okay. What we find is when we increase ion concentration, we're actually talking about like sodium, okay? So we're talking about sodium, okay? If we were to increase sodium concentration, and all this is in reference to the ECF, because we're going to use a word called emia, which means blood. This is a suffix that'll be added on to all these words we're going to use. So to describe an increase in sodium concentration in the ECF outside of the cell, this is the ICF, this would be our ECF. We would call that hypernatremia. Hypernatremia, okay? If it decreased, we call that hyponatremia. If it increased in potassium in the ECF, we call it hyperkalemia. And if it decreased, we call it hypokalemia. Okay? So we call that hypokalemia. Hyperkalemia, hypokalemia. Now, if we talk about potassium or calcium, if calcium was increased, we'd call that hypercalcemia. And if it was decreased, we'd call it hypocalcemia. Okay? Then when we talk about ion permeability, Na+, see that this has no effect if you increase or decrease sodium permeability. If you do potassium, it does have an effect, and we'll talk about that. But if you do calcium and you increase or decrease, then I'm pretty sure it does have an effect. Okay, I'm just thinking about how I want to walk through these example problems really quick. Let me just make sure I'm doing all this right. Okay, yeah, I think I got everything right here, so I'm going to do some practice problems. See if I can stop this down. That work? Then we can just keep going. Okay, perfect. So we have our graph here. And if we were to explain hypernatremia, what hypernatremia would mean is that, I'll just kind of draw it here. But hypernatremia would mean that we have an increase in sodium on the outside of the cell. Okay? We know that this first part of an action potential deals with sodium concentration. So if the sodium concentration is high on the outside, where does it want to go? It wants to go inside the cell based off of concentration gradient. And so what ends up happening is we see this would spike. We'd have a faster depolarization. You get higher, and then it would come down just as fast because we didn't mess with anything over here on the potassium. And so for hyponatremia, we'd see that it'd come a little bit slower. Let's just kind of draw this fake graph out so then we can kind of 94, negative 70 millivolts, right? Then we call that negative 55 millivolts, and then we call this positive 55 millivolts, okay? That's time we jumped a huge gap there, okay? So what ends up happening is we see that this would be our normal action potential. We hit threshold, we come up, we hyperpolarize, we come back, boom, back to rest of memory potential. This would be hypernatremia. In hyponatremia, that means that on the outside of the cell, okay, out here in the ECF, we have a low concentration of sodium. And so when we open up the channel for sodium to come in, it's very low. Sodium actually wants to come out if it's very low. And so, or it wants to come in slower, right? Because it wants to go from high concentration to low concentration. So if it's really low on the outside, it's just very slow to come in, lower than normal, right? And so what we'd see is it would take a while longer to come up. We wouldn't get as high, then we'd come down, we'd be the same right here with calcium, okay? Then what we see is this. If we had hyperkalemia, and this deals with potassium, what we would see is in the ECF, we would have an increase in potassium. Where does potassium want to go on a normal gradient potential? Well, it wants to come out of the cell through these potassium leak channels. If the potassium level is low on the inside and high on the outside, it's going to have to go against concentration gradient at that point, and it doesn't want to do that, so it's a lot slower. So we would actually see, if this one was normal, we would see that it would follow a normal trend with the sodium, but then it would take longer to get down, and we wouldn't have as big of a threshold. We'd come back up. And those are the effects we would see with hyperkalemia. Now, if we had hypokalemia, what is that? What are we saying that is? That means that we have, if this is our ICF, and this is our ECF, when we say we have hypokalemia, we're saying that that has a decrease in calcium and sodium, or in potassium on the outside of the cell. So if we have a decrease in potassium on the outside of the cell, that concentration gradient is stronger and wants to come out and flow on the outside. And so what we see is you have this desire for this potassium to come out stronger. And so what ends up happening is you get this sodium level that will stay the same here. You know, stay like normal. But then when those potassium come out, they'll go faster and they'll hyperpolarize more. And they'll come up. But we also see that it has an effect on the resting membrane potential. Both of these. And that was something that I failed to mention. And that is, if it's high in the ECF, and we have hyperkalemia, what ends up happening is these potassium ions do not want to leave the cell as fast or as much. So we continue to have more of a positive charge here. And this leads to depolarization. Okay? If we have depolarization, then actually our black one, our starting resting membrane potential is affected, because before, when we talked about electrophysiology with potassium, we know that potassium plays a role in that resting membrane potential. And so we would actually depolarize up here. And we would depolarize and we'd come this way. We depolarize and we go like that. And then this would stay normal, then that potassium would be stable. On the other hand, with hypokalemia, if it's low on the outside, this is going to hyperpolarize. And when this hyperpolarizes, we end up getting, well, if it's low out here, they want to come out more. This becomes more negative. So our starting resting membrane potential drops. And we start from here. And we come up like normal. we come up like normal. And then we have that faster drop down. And then this resting membrane potential would finish right where the new one had depolarized. And same goes for this. We'd come up and we'd repolarize up here. Okay? Last example would be with the hypercalcemia. What we would notice with hypercalcemia is that on the ECF, if calcium's high on the ECF, that extracellular fluid space, then it makes it slower for the potassium or the sodium channels to open, take a little bit longer. And so this first part would probably just take a little bit longer. If this was our normal in blue, this might take a little bit longer to get up to threshold. If this is threshold here. But once we get to threshold, it would stick the same as everything else with calcium. And then hypocalcemia. Then what they do is I'm going to explain it in this next drawing, but they're kind of like these ions that play a role on a spring that kind of help with dictating whether a voltage gated channel is going to open or not for sodium. And so what ends up happening is if you have high or low concentrations, they change how fast that gate opens. But regardless, it does open, but that stimulus part is just a little bit slower. For this one, it's a little faster because you have hypo, less calcium. So this part would be a little bit faster, and then once you hit threshold, it'll stay the same. And then that potassium part would be the same on that back end. Okay. All right. Moving on. I think that covers those things pretty well. And with permeability, all you're talking about is the effect of something crossing through the membrane. So if you had, if we adjusted the permeability of potassium coming in and out, if potassium could come out more, then that would play a role on affecting the graph. If we decrease the permeability, then it would kind of slow this backside down. And then with permeability of sodium, it wouldn't really have an effect. I guess if it's coming out, it would want to depolarize more if it's coming in. And same thing with the permeability of calcium. And that's how those would work. But I need to look more at that. Okay, I'm going to draw a max potential, and when I do that, it's also going to help me explain capacitance and length constants. So I'll erase this for now. Whew, man, I got a massive headache. Okay, so let's draw out a neuron really fast. I don't know if I'm going to be as detailed as I normally am. Here's what happens. This is your axon hillock. This is the dendrites right here, and you have the soma, right? It comes that way. Not too accurate of a cell drawing. Okay, this is gonna be my neuron. What ends up happening with a neuron is you have a stimulus that reaches here. And this stimulus could be anything that changes the charge in here. To exceed threshold, negative 55 millivolts. It could be hyperkalemia, where it stays a little bit more positive. It could be a sodium ligand gated channel or a different channel. And so we end up getting all these EPSPs that build up here that end up exceeding a threshold strong enough to exceed threshold. A stimulus strong enough to exceed threshold. So what ends up happening is you have an N8K plus pump. You have these sodium ions that flow into the cell, right? And when it exceeds threshold, you get this huge influx of sodium ions into the cell. And what ends up happening is you start to create this electrical field. And for simplicity, I'm going to explain it one way, and then I'll explain it another way with myelin, okay? But what ends up happening is that influence gets felt here, and it pops open another channel. Sodium rushes in. Right? And when the sodium rushes in, then that influence gets felt downstream. And we do it again. And what this is really doing is you have this protein embedded right here, kind of like an alpha helices. And what ends up happening is you have calcium built up in there. And on the membrane, you have a negative charge on the inside and a positive charge on the outside. And so what ends up happening is these charges kind of, the positive push down on the calcium and the negative charge pulled down on the calcium. And this calcium is controlling the gate on the sodium. And so when they pull up, it opens that gate. When it's pushed down by the positive, pulled down by the negative, that gate stays closed. When you have an influx of positive charge come in, what it does, it pushes up at an angle on those positive charges and counter those negative charges so they're not pushing on it, and starts pushing on those positive charges out. And the force ends up getting strong enough past threshold, negative 55 millivolts, that it ends up making it go past threshold. And that gate pops open and allows that to come in. And so we end up getting this up to positive 55 millivolts. And this is a state of depolarization. And right here, we were at negative 70 millivolts. Resting membrane potential. And then, you know, let's just say for simplicity's sake, we get the same thing coming in here. Boom. We get that positive charge letting in. And then this comes over. And what it's going to do is it's going to activate the Ca++ calcium channel where calcium will flood into the cell. And we'll get into this later when we talk about synapse. What ends up happening is you have these proteins on here called snare proteins. And the calcium is important because the calcium will come in and bind to the snare protein. And when it binds to the snare protein, it allows the snare protein to then grab these vesicles, which contain these neurotransmitters. And then they can then fuse with the membrane. They can then fuse with the membrane to then have this release of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft or synaptic gap, which is where we have synapse occur. And so what we're doing is we're taking this electrical signal and turning it into a chemical signal through neurotransmitters to communicate with other neurons. So in the meantime, while this is happening, we have these potassium leak channels, and we have these potassium gated channels, voltage gated channels, where potassium begins to come out of the cell. In an effort to try to depolarize in an effort to repolarize. So it's making an effort to repolarize the cell. And as it does this repolarization, this section here is called the absolute refractory period in this section. Okay, we end up having this absolute refractory period where we can't have an action potential stimulus. Even the strongest one couldn't make it go backwards or make it fire. So you have these potassium gated channels, they cause repolarization. And so they're gonna do that again and again and again, right? And what ends up happening is they repolarize it. And they're slow to shut, and so they end up overshooting. And we call that hyperpolarization. And then for simplicity, I'm not going to draw like 1 and 1 and 1. I'm just going to show how it does it down here. But what ends up happening is you end up getting this hyperpolarization state. And if we remember the graph, we use the sodium potassium ATPase pump, where we take 2 potassium back in, and we take 3 Na+ out, and then this kind of gets us back to RMP, resting membrane potential. And then we do it again, and it opens up. We hit all the way through. And so what ends up happening is this gets all the way down here. And because we have this influx of sodium, this depolarization, then we have the potassium falling behind it, leaking out, and so we have this hyperpolarization. Down here, when the sodium leaves the cell, it starts to become more negative. And when it does that, we go down through threshold, so the door shuts on the calcium. And so this is how we regulate and control the specificity and release of these neurotransmitters in these vesicles, because they won't release unless calcium is present. So if we have potassium catch up and change the voltage and repolarize the cell, then we end up shutting these doors on the calcium, and then we stop firing neurotransmitters or releasing them into the synaptic gap. Sorry, I got the biggest headache. Okay, so what ends up happening is, if we want to get into a more like a cooler way of explaining this, we can. And this is how we explain a couple important things of capacitance and length constant. And what we do is we explain these by using the same kind of model, but with myelin, okay? So I'm gonna draw another one right under here, a different neuron, just so I'm not drawn on top of each other. And this is our axon terminal. And right here is going to be our axon hillock. And this will be the length of our axon. And we call these concepts of capacitance and length constant, we call that propagation. And that's kind of what I explained up here. This is a lot more simple terms, kind of the flow chart I drew out and everything, but this is a very simple way of explaining, propagation, this charge propagating, moving down the neuron. And so what we see here is we have this stimulus that comes in. Something comes in, hyperkalemia, or we have sodium come in, or we have calcium or chloride come in, or we have calcium leave, or not come in, but hypercalcemia. I mean, we can have all these factors that can make this in here more positive, okay? And that's what happens, is it becomes more positive. And right here on the membrane, like I explained above, is we have this sodium voltage gated channel. And with this sodium voltage gated channel, what ends up happening is you have sodium that rushes in. But what caused that was this positive charge pushing up on the calcium in the alpha helix, allowing this gate to open up when it hit negative 55 millivolts, which is threshold. And what ends up happening is you get this electrical field that begins to occur. And you start to get this sphere of influence. We call it a length constant that goes down the neuron, or the axon. Now these bumps represent the myelin, known as myelin sheaths. And something really important about myelin is in between them, we have these nodes of Ranvier. And right here, we have another sodium voltage gated channel. Okay? And so what ends up happening is you have this voltage gated channel, and you have this sphere of influence that's floating down the axon. And on the neuron, we have a couple things. We have this separation of charge. And separation of charge is known as capacitance. And so we see in the unmyelinated areas, capacitance is high. But in the myelinated areas, capacitance is low. And we have less charges separated because their feel for each other is at a greater distance. And so, let's see, effects of myelin, constants, capacitance, and length constant. So we call this a length constant. And it's affected by many things. And what the myelin do is they do a couple things. With the length constant, anything on the inside, I think of this like a drum being pounded in a canyon. If this is the canyon and this sound wave's coming, there's a few things that can affect it. Fog in the air, and those would be what we call these negative amino acid R group proteins that are floating within the cell. And then we also have these charges on the outside. And this is what we call our RI. This is our internal resistance. So something to note. Our internal resistance is greater outside of the myelin than it is in the myelin. And so if the internal resistance is lower, this wong, this sound wave, this sphere of influence, electrical impulse, this positive charge can be felt further down the axon. And so what ends up happening is you also have a thickness in the membrane. And we call this RM. And the RM is increased in the myelinated areas because what ends up happening is RM stands for membrane permeability resistance. So the resistance to permeability of ions across the membrane. So if the resistance is greater, you have less ions leaving. So if we have less leaking channels of potassium and they're blocked during the myelinated sections, then what we see is it keeps that positive charge inside the cell and that it doesn't repolarize as fast. And so that active potential lasts longer, it can fire down the neuron. So we got RI covered, we have capacitance covered, we have RM covered. And so these things affect wavelength, which is the length constant. And so the way I like to think of it is if RM, the membrane permeability resistance, is high, wavelength will be high. As long as RI is low, the internal resistance, and the capacitance is low. Capacitance being that separation of charge. If you have a smaller separation of charge, then it'll lead to a smaller RI, which will lead to a greater wavelength. And so this length constant, capacitance, that's how they relate to each other. Is then we pop open this sodium channel door. Sodium comes rushing in. And we fire an action potential. And then this gets felt all the way through that myelinated area. And so what we see in multiple sclerosis is this disease, this degeneration of myelin. Right? And we see that people have these issues where their myelin isn't as strong or as thick or it's degenerated. And so multiple sclerosis is, when they're viewed on image, they appear white. And so you have these multiple white spots of where the myelin's not at. And so that is why it's called multiple sclerosis, multiple white spots. But what ends up happening is when the myelin's gone, your RM goes down, your wavelength goes down, your RI increases because you have more charge on the outside. And when I was given that canyon example of this sound on a drum going through a canyon, think of the charges on the sides as like the foliage, the leaves, the trees that also absorb some of that sound as it passes through. And so what we see is if you take the myelin off, your capacitance will increase. Permeability across the membrane increases because it's not as thick. Capacitance will increase, which then leads to RI increasing and a decrease in RM, and especially a decrease in the wavelength. So what ends up happening is it gets stopped before it can reach it to the next one. So it's just a lot slower, or even doesn't happen. And so that's why myelin is so important. It speeds up that process, allows the length constant to travel further, allows for an active potential to be made in the most effective way. So that's everything. Capacitance, length constants. Did all that with a massive headache. So this should be good. Thanks.